In the back corridor of the grandest television studio in town, a 9-year-old girl stood barefoot, her small hands wrapped tightly around a broken guitar as if it were her heartbeat. "If I sing well, will you give me a meal?" she asked, quietly, her eyes fixed on the man in the tailored suit standing before her. The producer laughed, a cruel sound that bounced off the walls. "A meal? Girl, you're not here to win anything. You're here to make the audience laugh." Kesha Williams didn't flinch. Her fingers brushed the loose strings of the battered instrument she had found in the trash 3 weeks earlier. "I understand perfectly, sir," she said, her calm tone startling him. For the first time, someone saw in that dirty, barefoot child a spark that didn't belong to defeat. Just hours earlier, she had been asleep under an awning when a group of production assistants woke her. They were searching for interesting faces for the night's episode, and when they saw her singing on the street, they thought they'd found the perfect comic act. "We'll put you last," the producer said, "after the talented ones. We'll end the show with a laugh." They didn't know who they were dealing with. In 3 years of street life, Kesha had learned the language of survival. She could read the truth behind smiles and tell who pitied her and who feared her. This time, she wasn't just a child being used for someone's amusement. She was a storm that had learned to wait for the right sky. She looked at the producer and asked, "Do you have children?" The question caught him off guard. "2 girls." "Why?" "Just curious," Kesha replied with a faint smile that unsettled him more than any insult could. Then she turned away, her mind already fitting pieces of a much larger plan together. In her torn backpack, she carried a letter her grandmother had written before she died. A letter that explained everything. While the other contestants were treated like royalty backstage, Kesha sat in silence, watching. Assistants rushed by carrying trays of food and makeup kits. When she approached the snack table, a woman gently blocked her path. "Sorry, sweetie. These are for the official participants. You must be accompanying someone." "I'm performing too," Kesha said softly. "Oh, you're the special girl," the assistant said, her smile heavy with false kindness. Kesha nodded and stepped back. The word special stung, but she had heard worse. She remembered her grandmother's voice again, warm as sunlight in a cold room. "They can take your home, your money, even your dignity, child. But what God put in your voice, no one can steal." Her grandmother had been a gospel singer in Harlem, one of the first black women to graduate from Juilliard. She taught Kesha discipline, pitch, and pride. When cancer took her, the world forgot Dorothy Williams, but her teachings remained alive in her granddaughter's voice. "Hey girl," the producer called out. "Do you even know any songs? We don't have time to waste." "I know a few," Kesha answered, strumming her guitar. He smirked. "Street music, huh? Rap? Whatever you sang for coins?" Kesha tilted her head, calm as ever. "Did you study music, sir?" "I have an MBA from UCLA. I don't need to play to recognize talent." She nodded slightly. "I understand perfectly." He didn't realize that her every question, every word, was deliberate. Every insult he threw became fuel. Inside her backpack, the yellowed envelope waited. Her grandmother's letter, a promise, a key to everything that was about to happen. Later, as Kesha tuned her guitar in the corner, a man with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses walked toward her. He looked at her with a strange familiarity. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked gently. "Kesha Dorothy Williams." The man froze. "Dorothy Williams was your grandmother?" "Yes." He blinked back tears. "Dorothy was my mentor. I'm James Mitchell, the director of this network. She taught me everything I know." "I know who you are," Kesha said. "My grandmother told me about you in her letter." James's voice trembled. "Where have you been?" "On the streets, since she passed." He felt the weight of shame settle on his shoulders. "Do you sing like her?" "She taught me everything," Kesha replied. "But please, don't interfere tonight. Let them do whatever they planned. Just record it, all of it." He frowned. "You know they're going to try to humiliate you." "I know," she said quietly. "But sometimes, humiliation is just the stage before glory." He didn't argue. There was something in her tone, something he remembered in Dorothy's eyes years ago. calm defiance. When her turn came, Richard called out mockingly, "It's your time to shine, little street girl. Try not to make the audience cry from laughter." Kesha stepped into the spotlight. The stage lights flared white, and for a moment, the crowd of 500 murmured at the sight of a barefoot child holding a broken guitar. "Hello?" she said softly into the microphone. "My name is Kesha Dorothy Williams. This song is for my grandmother, who taught me that music has no color and no class." The first notes rang pure and clean. For a second, the audience leaned in, then the speakers screeched with static. A horrible hiss filled the room. "Technical problems!" Richard shouted from backstage, pretending to panic. "We'll have to stop here." But Kesha didn't stop. She stepped away from the microphone and sang. Her voice cut through the noise, rising over the broken sound system, clear and strong. She sang Amazing Grace, blending gospel soul and classical precision. The audience grew silent. People rose to their feet, eyes wet. Richard's grin faded. "Turn everything off," he hissed, but James Mitchell had already given orders to keep every camera rolling. Kesha's voice soared higher, echoing against the rafters. When the last note fell, there was silence. 3 endless seconds, and then the crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the studio. James walked onto the stage, taking the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this girl is not just any contestant. She is the granddaughter of Dorothy Williams, one of the greatest gospel composers this country ever had. And tonight, you have witnessed her legacy live on." The crowd gasped. Cameras turned toward Richard, whose face drained of color. "The producers of this show brought her here to humiliate her," James continued, "but instead she reminded us what true talent looks like." Security escorted Richard out as the audience cheered for Kesha. She stood quietly, holding her guitar, tears in her eyes but her spine straight. James knelt beside her. "Your grandmother would be proud, Kesha." "She always said," Kesha whispered, "that the best answer to prejudice is excellence that can't be denied." The phrase spread like wildfire across America. The video of her performance went viral overnight, 50 million views in 24 hours. The network aired the full behind-the-scenes footage, exposing every cruel laugh, every word of mockery. Richard's career ended in a single day. Ashley, the blonde girl who had mocked Kesha, faced her own reckoning. Her parents withdrew her from her expensive conservatory and placed her in a public school, hoping humility would teach her what privilege never could. James Mitchell founded the Dorothy Williams Program, a scholarship fund for children from poor communities. Kesha was its first student. He and his wife later adopted her, saying she had brought back a piece of Dorothy they'd lost. 6 months later, Kesha stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall performing with the New York Philharmonic. She sang with the same broken guitar, now restored but carrying every scar of her journey. "This guitar taught me," she said, "that strength isn't about what we have, but what we create with what we have. And sometimes we need to be broken to find how high we can fly." The audience wept. Donations poured in, funding hundreds of scholarships. The show that once tried to humiliate a child was reborn under a new slogan written in gold: "Talent does not choose its birthplace." Richard tried to rebuild his name, but the world had moved on. Kesha's music filled radios and concert halls. She released her first album, Voices from the Street, which won a Grammy nomination. At the ceremony, she thanked her grandmother, her new family, and every child who had ever been told they weren't enough. Ashley, now a changed girl, sent her a letter of apology. "You taught me that real talent isn't about privilege," she wrote. "It's about courage." Kesha replied with kindness. Their friendship grew, living proof that forgiveness can build bridges over the deepest wounds. James often said in interviews, "Dorothy once told me that God uses unexpected people to teach lessons the world needs to learn." Kesha was that lesson. Today, as a young teen, Kesha runs the Dorothy Williams Foundation, helping hundreds of children find their voices. She still visits the same shelters she once slept in, her laughter filling the rooms that used to echo with silence. She tells the children, "Our gifts aren't just to lift ourselves, but to lift others. The world may try to shrink you, but you can always grow larger than their limits." And that's the truth that lives on through every note she sings. Proof that when life tries to bury light under dust, some souls shine so bright they turn darkness into their stage. Because real talent never asks permission to shine. It simply waits for the right moment to rise, and when it does, it rewrites every rule that once held it down. Years passed, and the world never stopped whispering the name Kesha Williams. From street corners to world stages, her story had become a living legend. But for Kesha, fame was never the destination. It was a tool, a voice to reach those who still felt invisible. She traveled from city to city, performing not for money or applause, but for the quiet faces sitting in the back rows. Children who came from nowhere, just like she once had. In every concert, she made sure the front seats were reserved for orphans, shelter kids, and street performers. She called it the promise seats. After one performance in Chicago, a small boy with torn shoes walked up to her backstage. He couldn't have been older than 7. "Miss Kesha," he said softly, "I don't have a home, but I sing too." She smiled and knelt beside him. "Then you already have everything you need," she said, handing him her grandmother's silver cross necklace. "Keep this, and remember, your voice is your home." That night, social media exploded again. Photos of Kesha with the boy went viral, not because she was a celebrity, but because she reminded people that kindness was still stronger than fame. But success came with its storms. The music industry tried to shape her into something marketable, an image, a brand. Big producers offered her millions to change her story, to turn her pain into polished pop. She refused. In one meeting, a record executive told her, "If you tone down the street angle and stop talking about poverty, you'll sell more." Kesha looked straight at him. "If I stop talking about poverty, then what I sell won't be music. It'll be silence." She walked out of the deal that day, leaving millions on the table but keeping her soul intact. The industry called her stubborn. The people called her real. 1 year later, she released an independent album titled Echoes of Grace. Every song carried pieces of her past, gospel chords, street rhythm, classical undertones. The album topped global charts without a label's support. The opening track, Broken Strings, opened with a single guitar strum and her soft voice whispering, "Even a cracked bell can ring the truth." Her foundation expanded to multiple countries. James Mitchell, now in his late 70s, watched proudly as the little girl he once met backstage became a global ambassador for hope. He often said, "She's not just Dorothy's granddaughter. She's Dorothy reborn." When he passed away peacefully one spring morning, Kesha didn't announce it to the press. She held a private memorial in Harlem, at the same church where her grandmother used to sing. The pews were filled with children from her program, all dressed in white. During the service, Kesha stood before them with her guitar. "When I was a child," she said, "I thought music was about being heard. Now I know it's about helping others find their own song." Her fingers danced across the strings, and she sang a quiet hymn written by her grandmother decades ago. The melody rose through the church windows, reaching the open sky, where it felt like both Dorothy and James were listening. Months later, at the United Nations Global Forum, Kesha was invited to speak about the power of art in healing poverty. World leaders, artists, and activists gathered as she walked to the podium, wearing a simple black dress and her broken guitar slung across her back. "I once thought a voice could only change your life if it was heard by millions," she said. "But I learned that if your voice changes even one heart, it has already changed the world." The hall rose in applause. Some called it the most powerful speech of the decade. After the event, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. A young journalist caught up to her and asked, "Kesha, after everything you've achieved, what still keeps you going?" She smiled. "The next child who's about to give up." Her words became another headline, but for her, they were simply the truth. Years rolled on. Kesha continued to write songs that healed broken souls. She collaborated with musicians from slums, refugee camps, and war zones, teaching them how to turn pain into power. Her concerts weren't just shows, they were movements. At 40, she returned to Los Angeles, to the same studio where it all began. The network, now under new management, invited her to perform at the show's 30th anniversary. The stage had changed, but the memories hadn't. When she walked onto the same spot where she once stood barefoot, she felt the ghosts of laughter and tears still echoing in the walls. The host handed her the microphone and said, "Welcome home, Kesha." She looked around and smiled. "Home is wherever your voice is finally heard." Then she began to sing. No lights, no effects, no band, just her and that old guitar, still scarred but shining under the stage lights. The audience wept as her voice filled the air like a prayer finally completed. As the final note faded, Kesha whispered, "For my grandmother, for James, and for every child still waiting for their song." The audience rose, applauding for minutes that felt like eternity. That night, millions watched around the world. People didn't just see a superstar. They saw a story that refused to die, a spirit that turned pain into melody. And when the lights dimmed, one small girl sitting at home whispered to her mother, "Mama, I want to sing too." The circle had begun again. Because the truth Kesha carried had outlived her struggles. Talent can be ignored. Beauty can fade. Fame can vanish. But a voice born from truth, it never dies. It becomes part of the wind, whispering to every child who dares to dream. Don't wait for the world to open its door. Sing until the walls disappear. The years continued to move like quiet rivers, and Kesha Williams became more than an artist. She became a living message. Her story was taught in schools, her songs echoed through hospitals, shelters, and city streets. She had turned her scars into symphonies, and the world listened. But for Kesha, the music never belonged to fame, it belonged to faith. She bought back the old television studio where she was once humiliated. The same hall where laughter once mocked her now stood as the Dorothy Williams Academy of Art and Humanity. Children from all over the world came to learn there, some who had nothing, some who had lost everything, but all who carried a spark. One winter morning she walked through the academy halls, running her fingers across the photos that lined the walls. One showed her barefoot on that old stage. Another showed her grandmother holding a microphone in a Harlem church. There was one of James Mitchell smiling beside her during her first Grammy ceremony. She stopped, looked at it, and whispered softly, "We did it." Her assistant came running down the corridor. "Miss Kesha, the children are ready for your class." She smiled and stepped into the rehearsal hall. Inside were 30 children, their eyes wide with hope. Some held cracked violins, others cheap guitars, and one small girl hugged a cardboard box she used as a drum. Kesha sat among them on the floor. "Tell me," she asked gently, "why do you want to make music?" A boy raised his hand. "Because I want to be famous." She smiled kindly. "Fame is a sound that fades." "Try again." A girl whispered, "Because music makes me forget I'm poor." Kesha nodded. "Then you're already rich where it matters most." She picked up her old guitar, the same one she had carried from the streets to Carnegie Hall, and began strumming the strings. "Close your eyes," she said. "Don't think about notes or rhythm, just feel. Music isn't something you play, it's something that plays through you." The children followed her lead. The room filled with uneven chords, offbeat rhythms, and laughter. Yet somehow, in that mess of sound, something beautiful began to form. Kesha smiled through tears. "That," she whispered, "is what truth sounds like." Outside, reporters waited for her. They asked endless questions about fame, wealth, success. But Kesha only said, "The greatest award I've ever received is seeing children who once had no hope, now standing tall with their own songs." That night, she sat alone in her office, watching the city lights flicker through the window. A letter lay on her desk, handwritten, yellowed with time. It was her grandmother's letter, the same one she'd carried since childhood. The ink had faded, but the words still burned bright. "My dear Kesha, when life becomes too heavy, remember, the light inside you is older than fear. Don't chase applause, chase meaning. Don't sing to be heard, sing to heal." She folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "I'm still following your song, Grandma." A week later, the Academy held its first grand performance. Hundreds gathered, parents, teachers, strangers, and reporters. The stage glittered, but the true brilliance came from the small children stepping into the spotlight, holding their simple instruments with pride. Kesha stood behind the curtain watching them. When one of the children froze in fear, she gently walked on stage, knelt beside him, and whispered, "Do you hear the crowd?" The boy nodded nervously. "They're not here to judge you," she said. "They're here to meet your heart. Let them." The boy smiled, took a deep breath, and began to sing. His voice cracked at first, but then it steadied, strong, trembling, real. The audience cheered, and Kesha's eyes filled with tears. When the show ended, a reporter approached her again. "Kesha, after all you've built, what comes next?" She thought for a long moment. "Silence," she said. I want to spend time listening to others, to the world, to what music still hasn't said yet. Kesha Williams was only 13, but her life already felt like a story people told to remind themselves that miracles still existed. Yet, as the months passed after the Grammys, she began to learn that success could be both a blessing and a burden. Every time she walked through a crowd, people wanted a piece of her. Reporters asked questions that had little to do with her music. Photographers followed her to rehearsals, to school, even to the park. The world saw her as a symbol, but inside she was still the girl who once sang under the awning for coins, clutching a broken guitar. James and Margaret did everything they could to protect her. Their house was filled with warmth and quiet laughter, and sometimes when the evenings were calm, they would sit by the fireplace and talk about Dorothy. Kesha missed her grandmother's voice, but she could almost feel her presence whenever she sang. Still, the music industry wasn't as gentle as those nights by the fire. Record labels called every week, offering millions for albums that didn't yet exist. Managers promised fame that would last forever. But Kesha had learned from Dorothy that the wrong kind of promise could steal a person's soul. She kept going to the Los Angeles Music Academy, balancing fame with her studies. Some students treated her like a star. Others avoided her, intimidated by her story. One afternoon, while practicing in an empty classroom, a janitor paused to listen at the door. When she finished the song, he smiled softly and said, "You sing like someone who remembers where she came from." Kesha smiled back. "That's because I never left," she said. It became her quiet mantra, the reminder that she was still the same girl from the streets, only now with a wider stage. Months turned into years. Her first major world tour began when she was 15. The opening concert took place in New York City, just blocks from the Harlem church where Dorothy had once sung gospel every Sunday. Before stepping onto the stage, Kesha stood in silence backstage, holding the old guitar that had survived everything with her. James wanted her to use one of the gleaming new instruments custom made for her, but she refused. "This guitar knows my story," she told him. "I want the world to hear its voice too." When the lights dimmed and the crowd of 20,000 went silent, she began with Amazing Grace, the same song that had once transformed humiliation into victory. The audience sang along, thousands of voices blending into a single chorus. By the end, tears glistened on faces across the arena. Even the hardest critics wrote that night that they had never seen a performance so honest. But behind the applause, Kesha knew that fame was a fragile friend. The more people admired you, the more they wanted to own your image. After the tour, Kesha took a break to focus on the Dorothy Williams program. She traveled to small towns and poor neighborhoods, listening to children sing on street corners the way she once had. In Detroit, she found a shy boy named Malik, whose voice was raw but filled with pain and hope. In New Orleans, she met twin sisters who built their own drums from tin cans and bottle caps. Every child reminded her of herself, of hunger, of courage, of the fire that refused to die. The program grew rapidly. Within 2 years, it supported over 1,000 young musicians across the country. Kesha insisted that every child in the program learn about her grandmother. Dorothy believed that talent is a seed, she told them, but it only grows if you water it with kindness. She didn't just fund their lessons. She visited them, wrote songs with them, taught them how to turn their struggles into melodies. Journalists began calling her the heart of a generation, but she laughed when she heard that. "I'm just paying back a debt to a woman who gave me everything," she said. Still, even as she poured herself into helping others, the weight of expectation pressed harder on her shoulders. She began to have nights when she couldn't sleep. The glare of the spotlight was constant, and sometimes she longed for the quiet of the streets, not the hunger, not the cold, but the freedom. One evening, sitting by the window of her room, she whispered, "Grandma, I wish I could hear your advice again." The wind outside shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain, and for a moment, Kesha thought she heard Dorothy's voice. "When the world gets too loud, sing softer. The ones who truly listen will still hear you." That whisper became the inspiration for her second album, Soft Thunder. It wasn't a pop album or something designed for the charts. It was filled with slow, soulful tracks that spoke about loss, forgiveness, and rediscovering peace. Critics called it too quiet at first. But as weeks passed, listeners began to find healing in those songs. They said it felt like sitting under warm light after a storm. The album went platinum in 3 months. Kesha didn't celebrate with a party. Instead, she spent the night at a homeless shelter, performing for people who reminded her of who she once was. During that performance, she met an old woman who reminded her of Dorothy, fragile, with silver hair and eyes full of stories. After the show, the woman said, "Child, the way you sing, it's like you're giving people back their hope." Kesha smiled and replied, "That's what my grandmother used to say." The woman touched her hand. "Then keep doing it. The world forgets too easily." Remind them. A year later, an unexpected challenge arrived. A new producer joined the network that broadcast Stars of America, the same show where Kesha had once been humiliated. He wanted to create a special anniversary episode to celebrate the program's revival. He called James, proposing that Kesha return as a guest judge. At first, she hesitated. The stage where she had been mocked still carried scars in her memory. But James reminded her of Dorothy's words. "We don't heal by forgetting. We heal by returning stronger." So she agreed. When she walked back onto that stage, it was surreal. Everything looked different, brighter, more respectful. The slogan "Talent does not choose its birthplace" shone in golden letters across the backdrop. The audience erupted in applause when she appeared. But instead of taking her seat immediately, Kesha walked to the center of the stage and placed her old guitar on a stand. "This," she said softly, "is where I learned that humiliation can become harmony if you let it. I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm here to listen." The show that night was unlike any other. Contestants came from every background imaginable. One little girl, barefoot like Kesha had been, sang a haunting lullaby about losing her mother. The audience wept. When the child finished, Kesha stood and walked to her, embracing her as the crowd cheered. "You don't need my approval," she whispered. "You already have the song inside you." The cameras captured the moment, and by the next morning, it had spread across the internet as the hug that healed America. As the years rolled on, Kesha continued balancing her artistry and advocacy. By 18, she had composed scores for films, written a book titled Voices of the Forgotten, and established a music school in Harlem in her grandmother's name. Yet, despite the accolades, she remained grounded. She often walked through neighborhoods unnoticed, sitting on park benches and listening to street performers. She believed that real music wasn't born in studios. It was born in survival. One afternoon, while visiting a youth center in Chicago, she heard a boy rapping in the corner. His words were sharp, filled with anger, but beneath them was fear. After he finished, Kesha approached and asked, "Who taught you to write like that?" He shrugged. "No one listens, so I write for myself." She handed him her card. "Then let's make them listen." That boy, whose name was Jordan, would later become one of the most promising artists to come out of the Dorothy Williams program. He often said that Kesha didn't just change his life, she gave him permission to exist. Fame continued to chase her, but Kesha learned how to use it wisely. When reporters asked about her luxurious lifestyle, she showed them videos of her students performing in shelters. When brands offered endorsement deals, she redirected the money to fund scholarships. People called her idealistic, but she didn't care. "You can't spend fame," she once told an interviewer, "but you can invest it in people, in hope, in change." Then came the hardest chapter. At 19, James fell ill. Years of relentless work had taken their toll. Kesha stayed by his side in the hospital, holding his hand through every night of uncertainty. One evening, he told her, "Dorothy would be proud. You turned pain into purpose, Kesha. You've done more good in 10 years than most do in a lifetime." She smiled through tears. "You and Grandma were the reason I believed in myself." When he passed away, the world mourned him as a visionary, but Kesha mourned him as a father. At his funeral, she sang a song she had written for him titled "The Bridge You Built." The lyrics spoke of guidance, faith, and love that outlives death. The performance was so raw that even strangers wept. After his passing, Kesha took a break from public life. For months, she traveled alone through small towns and quiet roads, seeking clarity. She visited the church where Dorothy had sung, the park bench where she used to sleep, and even the alley where she had first played her broken guitar. Each place whispered a memory. In one of those nights, she finally understood. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong.